They tell you not to go there. Even in a place as cursed as Chernobyl, there is one patch of land that everyone whispers about, a place where the air feels heavy, where the trees lean at strange angles, and where even the bravest guides lower their voices without realizing it. They call it the Red Forest. The name sounds almost beautiful, like something from a fairy tale, but the story of this forest is not a fairy tale. It's a nightmare that didn't end when the reactor exploded. It's what happens when nature is forced to live in a world built on radiation, silence, and lies. And what scientists found in the Red Forest is far worse than anyone expected, because the Red Forest didn't just die. It changed, it adapted, it became something new. This is the story of what really lives there, what it looks like, what it does to anything that enters, and why, almost 40 years later, it still terrifies the people who study it. On the night of April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant tore itself apart. The explosion ripped off a 1,000-ton steel lid, turned tons of graphite into burning shrapnel, and shot a column of radioactive particles a kilometer into the sky. Pieces of the reactor core, glowing with energy, rained down over the surrounding countryside. One of the first victims of that invisible storm was a thick pine forest just west of the plant. In the hours after the explosion, a radioactive cloud drifted low over the trees. Every needle, every branch, every root was bombarded with levels of radiation, so extreme that instruments near the forest maxed out and went silent. Then something eerie happened. The trees did not burst into flames. They didn't crumble into ash. They changed color. Within days, the deep green of the pines faded into an unnatural rusty orange. Entire groves shifted to copper and red, as if autumn had arrived overnight. Soldiers arriving on site described looking out over the forest and seeing what looked like a sea of dead fire. No smoke, no flame, just a still, motionless burn. They didn't know it at the time, but the radiation had destroyed the chlorophyll inside the needles, the very pigment that lets trees turn sunlight into life. What was left behind was a reddish-brown pigment and a forest that was, in every way, dead on its feet. That's how the name was born, the Red Forest. But as with everything in Chernobyl, the name only tells part of the story, because killing the trees wasn't enough. The Red Forest was so contaminated that the Soviet authorities made a brutal decision. They sent in liquidators, soldiers, workers, and volunteers to cut down the dead pines, pile them into mounds, and bury them in trenches lined with sand and clay. Imagine that, an entire forest, bulldozed into a grave. Men in thin protective suits drove machines that were themselves becoming radioactive by the hour. Some worked so close to the heart of the fallout that their dosimeters had to be taken away because the readings were too high and too frightening. Tree after tree fell. Whole swathes of forest were pushed into pits, covered, marked, and left. On the maps, these areas were just called burial sites. But nothing buried in Chernobyl ever really stays in the ground. Radiation seeps. It leaks into the air, the water, the soil. It sits in the dust, waiting for wind, paws, wheels, or boots to carry it somewhere new. You would expect, after all of that the Red Forest would remain a dead zone forever. You'd imagine a barren wasteland, no birds, no animals, no movement, just skeletons of trees and piles of contaminated earth slowly crumbling under the rain. But that's not what happened, because nature, when it's attacked, doesn't always lie down and die. Sometimes it adapts. Decades after the explosion, when the world's attention had moved on, a new wave of scientists came to Chernobyl to study what remained. They were prepared to see destruction. What they weren't prepared for was life. Not clean, healthy life. Not a thriving, untouched forest. Something much stranger. In satellite images, the Red Forest looked like it had healed. From a distance, it was green again, surrounded by fields, wetlands, and the quiet concrete skeletons of Pripyat and the power plant. But satellites don't show details. They don't show what happens when you actually walk between the trees. On the ground, the red forest feels wrong. You notice it before you even hear the Geiger counter. The air is different, stale, metallic, with an odd taste that clings to the back of your throat. The light seems flatter, harsher, like it's passing through something you can't see, and then the device in your hand starts to scream. The closer you get to the heart of the forest, the faster the radiation levels climb. Then the clicks blur into a high, continuous whine. In some spots, the levels are dozens of times higher than the surrounding areas. In others, they spike unexpectedly and then drop, as if pockets of contamination sit just beneath the surface, waiting for a footstep or a gust of wind to stir them up. Guides who take scientific teams there know exactly where not to stand. They've learned the hard way. The forest floor is covered with dry needles and moss, but they decompose slowly, far more slowly than in most other places. Radiation has disrupted the microorganisms that break down organic matter. Leaves fall, branches snap, needles drift to the ground, and simply stay there. It's as if time moves differently here, not faster, not slower, just wrong. But the strangest thing isn't the dead material, it's the living. Because somehow, despite everything, the red forest is full of animals. Wolves pad silently through the pines, boars root through the soil, deer pick their way between buried trunks and twisted roots, birds nest in branches that still pulse with radiation. There are more large mammals here than in many clean forests. No hunting, no roads, no chainsaws, no cities. While humans fled, wildlife moved in. At first glance, it looks like a miraculous recovery, a testament to how resilient nature can be when humans get out of the way. But if you look closer, the miracle starts to look more like a warning. Many of the animals in and around the red forest show subtle deformities. Birds with strange patches of white feathers, rodents with cataracts in both eyes, insects with wings that don't fit their bodies, mice born with spinal issues that twist their backs into permanent arches. Not every animal is visibly affected. Many look normal. But when researchers study their DNA, they find a battlefield. Broken strands, repeated segments, damaged repair mechanisms, mutations stacked on mutations. Radiation doesn't just kill, it rewrites. Some of those rewrites are lethal. Those genes never make it to the next generation, but some of them stick. Over generations, a new kind of balance starts to emerge. Blackbirds living in contaminated parts of the zone have darker plumage and more melanin, a pigment that doesn't just color feathers, but can help absorb and neutralize some radiation. Some insects show increased resistance to DNA damage. Certain plants that should have died out long ago cling stubbornly to life, growing in warped, uneven ways that don't match any textbook. The red forest is no longer the forest it once was. It's an experiment nobody meant to run. An evolutionary pressure cooker. And the question is no longer, how much did Chernobyl kill? The question is, what is Chernobyl creating? Spend enough time in the red forest, and you start to notice patterns. It's not just that the animals are there, it's the way they move. Wolves that should avoid humans watch from a distance, not fleeing, not approaching, just studying. Foxes trot along the edges of dirt roads, occasionally stopping and staring into the trees for long, unnatural stretches of time, as if listening to something. Birdsong is off. Some calls sound thinner, weaker, incomplete. Others are lower or higher than normal, as if the bird's vocal cords never developed quite right. To the untrained ear, it's just a strange soundscape. To biologists, it's evidence written in notes and tones. Radiation damages developing brains. Birds learn songs from their parents. When those parents' songs are broken, so are the next generations. Even the spiders seem different. In parts of the zone, scientists have found webs that are messy, lopsided, poorly constructed. Not all of them, but enough that it stands out. In the same way a doctor can tell when a heartbeat is irregular, a trained eye can see when nature's patterns are off. and the forest is full of irregular patterns. Trees don't grow straight. Trunks split and curve without obvious cause. Branches cluster more on one side than the other, as if the tree were trying to lean away from something in the soil, or towards something only it can sense. The deeper you go, the stronger the feeling that this isn't just a forest reacting to damage. It's a system reorganizing itself around a new reality, a reality where radiation is not an accident, but a permanent fact of life. For the people who work in and around the exclusion zone, the red forest has taken on an almost mythic quality. They know the numbers, they know the science, they know how to read the ticks of a Geiger counter, and the fine print of radiation exposure charts. And yet, when they talk about the red forest, they use different words. They say it's angry. They say it's restless. They say it has a memory. Guides will joke about ghosts and monsters when tourists are around, but when the cameras are put away, the tone changes. They talk about radios that suddenly crackle with static when they step too close to certain patches of ground, about GPS devices that freeze for no reason, about batteries that die much faster here than anywhere else. They'll tell you about sudden headaches that hit like a hammer and vanish the moment they step back behind the tree line, about the strange, oppressive silence that settles over everything on some days, as if the entire forest is holding its breath. And they'll tell you the one rule that everyone follows. You do not linger in the red forest. Even the bravest, the ones who laugh at fear and boast about walking near the ruins of Reactor 4, go quiet here. They check their watches, they check their instruments, and then they leave. Quickly. The official story is that the red forest is dangerous because of radiation. And that's true. In some parts of it, an hour of exposure will give you more radiation than you'd absorb in an entire year of normal life. Many of the buried trees remain hot. Disturbing the soil can kick up radioactive dust that clings to clothing and skin. It's not a place to be casual, but underneath the official warnings, there's something else. Something unspoken. The sense that this is not just a contaminated piece of land, but a place where the natural order has been permanently knocked off its axis. You can see it in the way life behaves here, in the things that thrive when they should die, in the things that die for no clear reason at all, and in one of the strangest discoveries of all. Sometimes the red forest seems to resist decay. Branches that should have rotted away years ago are still intact, as if the bacteria and fungi that normally recycle dead wood are working in slow motion or simply missing. Leaf litter piles up in dense layers, preserved not by cold or dryness, but by disrupted ecosystems too damaged to clean up after themselves. In that sense, the red forest is like a museum of its own destruction. It holds on to things that should have vanished. It keeps its own past close. Scientists have a name for what's happening here. Ecological succession under chronic radiation. It sounds clinical, almost boring. They write detailed papers, they measure mutation rates, they compare species inside and outside the zone. But every so often, one of them slips and says what they really feel. They talk about unease, about standing in a place where life is clearly present, but doesn't feel quite right. One researcher confessed after years of returning to Chernobyl, "It looks like a normal forest until you stay still long enough. Then you realize nothing is truly normal here. Not the trees, not the birds, not even the silence." Another said, "This is evolution in fast forward, but not in a way we ever wanted to see." Some even worry quietly about what's being learned here, not by humans, but by life itself. Radiation is a brutal teacher. It rewards resilience and punishes weakness. It doesn't care about beauty, balance, or harmony. The species that survive in the red forest are the ones that can handle their DNA being attacked over and over, generation after generation. The ones that can work around broken code, damaged repair systems, and constant cellular stress. They are not stronger in a heroic romantic way. They are simply harder to kill. And that's what unnerves some biologists the most. Because if life can learn to live in the red forest, if it can adapt to permanent high-level radiation, if it can turn the worst nuclear disaster in history into just another environment, what else can it adapt to? What else could we force it to endure? And what would those future ecosystems look like? Today, tourists sign up for Chernobyl tours and pose under rusting Ferris wheels in Pripyat. They film videos in abandoned schools, point their phones at gas masks on the floor, and chase clicks with thumbnails of crumbling buildings and eerie hallways. Most of them never step foot in the Red Forest. If they do, it's usually just a glimpse, from a bus window on the way to the plant. A blur of trees and scrub, a quick mention from the guide. That is the Red Forest. We do not go in. And then it's gone, swallowed by distance. But the Red Forest doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need anyone to believe in it. It will keep changing, year after year, long after the tours stop and the fences rust away. Long after the sarcophagus over Reactor 4 needs to be replaced again. Long after the last person who remembers the explosion is gone. Because for the Red Forest, Chernobyl wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The beginning of an experiment no one asked to start. The beginning of a new kind of wilderness, shaped not just by sunlight and rain, but by fallout and decay. And the most terrifying part? We don't know how this story ends. We only know this. There is a place next to the ruins of Chernobyl where radiation and life have made an uneasy truce. A place where wolves hunt in contaminated shadows, where birds sing broken songs, and where trees remember the day the sky turned white. A place that should have stayed dead, but didn't. They call it the Red Forest. And what they've found there isn't just terrifying. It's a glimpse of what happens when the world we built collides with the world we cannot control, and nature decides to keep going anyway.